one thing we don't talk enough about, I believe, in the CrossFit space is the difference between the methodology or the philosophy of CrossFit as it was written many years ago by Greg Glassman and today's competitive CrossFit sport.
Yep.
Because those are two different branches. They have the same name, but they're absolutely not the same thing. And I really encourage anybody who's interested in CrossFit to go back and read the original CrossFit Journal articles, where CrossFit is very precisely described. And I think it's a great piece of writing. It's a great mini ebook article, whatever you want to call it. There's only a couple details that I wouldn't agree with. Everything else I think is really, really well thought out. But there has been a split at some point when we went from CrossFit as a GPP methodology to complement your sport, to complement your life, to now turning it into a sport. Those are two different things. The problem is a lot of people have kept kind of staying in between those two. So not committing fully to one side or the other. The original CrossFit philosophy is very minimalist in its essence. The idea is not to do as much as you can. The idea is to do just enough so that you can get better, and to switch up the stimuli so you can always get something new and always improve in many different ways, keep the training fun, and then go and apply your fitness in a sport or in an activity that you're doing. This is the essence of CrossFit. The competitive sport today is almost the antithesis of that, because there's huge amounts of volume that are necessary to get to the highest level. You need to be able to tolerate, like I said, 4 days of competition, 14 competitive events that are very, very hard. It's probably one of the most demanding competitions out there. And again, you can't get from one to the other, or vice versa. So you really have to think about, okay, am I doing this, for my health, and as a complement to the other activities that I have, or is that my competitive sport? Because that will largely determine how you should approach it and what's going to be necessary to get better at it.
Yeah.
So you've just partly answered the question I was going to ask you, is that for the everyday athletes, at home doing this, as I mentioned, there are a few, I think they're called boxes, right? CrossFit boxes.
Yep.
There are a couple in my town, and I've got friends who do it. So are they doing CrossFit? And that is very different to someone who is actually working towards going to the CrossFit games. Like, what's the difference between my friend down the road and someone who's doing it? And I also want to ask you about, are there people doing it professionally? How much money do they make? I also wanted to ask you that.
So the purists will tell you that everything is CrossFit, because everything falls under the CrossFit banner one way or another. But I think the multimodal approach is definitely one of the main tenets of CrossFit. So I would say that, yeah, your friends they're doing CrossFit, and then they're kind of training using CrossFit as a methodology, as an approach. In most boxes, again, it's not very clear which one you're working towards. Is it a GPP CrossFit or is it a competitive sport CrossFit? I would argue that if you're doing CrossFit for your health and for general prep, there's a bunch of movements that you don't necessarily need to do. A snatch, for example, it's a great expression of athleticism, but if you start sports at 40, maybe you don't have the hips, the shoulders, and the ankles in order to do it in a safe way, and maybe that's not the best way for you to express your fitness at that point in time. And just because it is on the docket in CrossFit doesn't mean that you have to do it. Again, it depends. If you compete, you have to, because you have to be proficient at it, because it might pop up. But if you don't, I would argue that you don't necessarily need to do it. Should you work towards it? Should you try and build the mobility, build the coordination and all the qualities necessary to get there? Maybe. Is there other ways to spend your time and build physical qualities that would be equivalent or better? Possibly. I think that's for everybody to think about. That's for coaches to think about as well. But yeah, I would say that whether you compete or not, you're doing CrossFit if you're kind of following that idea of working on different qualities, trying to be as good a generalist as you can become. And then to your next question on competitive CrossFitters and professional CrossFitters, there are, I would say, many dozens of them that do practice, or that do have that as a main profession, main job. It's going to vary. How they make their income is going to vary between cash prizes at competition, which for some are bigger than others, Depends on the competition. Who is it? A CrossFit sanctioned competition? Is it an independent competition that has some money to put into it? And then mostly sponsors. Whether it's supplements, whether it's brands. Obviously, as you said, CrossFit is very popular today, and I think it's still growing in many areas of the world. I know in Europe it's exploding right now. The semifinals in Lyon were absolutely crazy from an atmosphere standpoint, and I'm excited to go again next year. And so obviously, all the big brands are coming in. Claudia has been sponsored by Puma for a couple years now. And you see Nike sponsoring some big athletes. You see Reebok.
That's how you know a sport's growing.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's getting bigger and bigger. It's obviously challenging to get from I'm working a job and training on the side to I'm training full time, because oftentimes the bottleneck is time, as always. Because if you want to be recognized by big brands, you need to perform in big competitions. If you want to do that, you need to be able to train full time or close to it. But you can't do that if you have a job on the side, but you can't let go of your job to get into it. So it's the usual catch-22 of changing income streams, like any entrepreneur will know as well. But that's kind of the lay of the land on that side. Thanks for watching this clip. If you want to access the full podcast that we recorded with David and Xylon, it's the 1% Better podcast. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcast. The link is in the description. Make sure you leave them a 5-star review and a comment if you can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.